Oh, hello. Today we're going to talk about envy, or more specifically, jealousy. This is one of those trans videos that I make every now and then. Ever since I began my modest career as a YouTuber, I've noticed that quite a lot of people talk about wanting to look like me, which I'm flattered. I wish I could look like me too. And for the longest time, I didn't see anything wrong with this. I like to think that I look presentable, at least on here, on occasion. But a few weeks ago, I encountered a pretty nasty phenomenon. One, I received an email from a fan who was almost distraught after watching my video on passing, saying that, well, passing isn't really a goal that you should look up to. And she felt, well, what's the point? Should I even care? I will never look as good as you do. And at around the same time, I had a sort of crisis of confidence in my own transition as well. I had the same thought, but about someone else. I will never look as good as she does. The person who wrote to me was jealous of me, and I was jealous of someone else. And I noticed that for a lot of trans people, envy is a sort of social default. And that's kind of messed up. But first, we need to step back a significant bit. Around 2010, I started reading this webcomic called Questionable Content. It's a webcomic that featured the indie music nerd Martin and his friends talking about life and romance and, well, a lot of indie music. It was a pretty standard slice of life webcomic, and just very nice and wholesome, which, you know, in times like this is something that a lot of us can need. The comic started around 2003 and has been going steady pretty much every weekday ever since, and has since become part of my daily routine. I wake up, I make myself some tea, and I read the webcomic for the day. And most days it gives me a small hit of joy in the morning. Now obviously this video isn't about the comic, but if you take any way away from this video, it is that the webcomics is pretty good and I can definitely recommend it. It also has horny robots that fuck. Around 2012, the webcomic introduced the character of Claire Augustus, a shy and slightly awkward library student. And she's a trans woman. At the time, I had seen almost no media representation about trans women that was in any way positive. Orange is the New Black was hailed as almost revolutionary for having a supporting character be trans, and that wasn't to be released for another year and a half. So, from my 19-year-old early transitioning experience, it was pretty comforting to see a trans woman just be sort of normal. Media representations of trans women often focus almost exclusively on their transness, on their transitions, and how that interacts with their surroundings. And, unfortunately, that's also what a lot of people, cis and trans, want to see from trans creators. So that is what is created. That is what this video is. The character of Claire was met with very positive reactions, which was a surprise to me because this is the internet and everything is awful all the time, and things being good here don't make that much sense to me. A reason as to why, though, might be because the transness of the character is treated as significant, but not as ongoing. As in, she is trans, but that's not what she is centered around, or what defines her. The character in the comic eventually goes on to become part of the inner circle of the cast members and features more and more in the series, eventually becoming the love interest of the main character. It's safe to say that the character is not only passing within the fiction of the comic, but doing so while being stealth. No one in her surroundings know of her trans status, except for the select few that she's told. She's not openly trans, which today might be seen as more of the standard trans norm. But in 2012, stealth was the default. The idea was that transitioning is something that eventually finishes, and that finish line is symbolized by being able to no longer have to refer to being trans again. You should be able to not only pass and be what you identify as, but you should be able to escape the trappings of having to be defined by being trans, which is what often happens when you're openly trans and people won't shut the fuck up about it. And for me in 2012, I found myself thinking on occasion, I wish I could be like that. This isn't a fault on the comic, by the way. The character is probably the best trans representation I've ever seen in any type of media. But the character's transness is very typical of the mindset that was prominent at the time, and still today in some trans circles, even if being openly trans is far more accepted today. So being a trans woman in 2012, whose trans advice came from sites with, at best, questionable content, Claire not only became wholesome positive representation, but also a source of inspiration and jealousy. Not for the actual character, of course, it's a webcomic and it's not real, or so my therapist tells me, but for the things that she represented. Basically, being finished with her transition. A lot of media that features trans women usually depicts us as either being finished or early in our transitioning. The depiction furthers the idea of transitioning as a very linear process from one to the other, from unfinished to finished, from pre-op to post-op, and from male to female. I remember people saying in 2012 that you're only trans while you transition, and when you finish, you stop being trans. You have become the gender that you are, and that being trans is a temporary thing, which obviously makes no sense. Whatever being finished with your transition means is different for each and every person. And it's not clear if Claire thinks that she is finished with her transition or not. But for me, her version of current transness was the goal of my transness future.
Oh, you there, boy. I am the ghost of transness future.
But for me, and for many trans people, that simply wasn't possible. Or it is, but it's almost impossible to get there. For me in 2012, it was basically impossible. I was dead broke from buying my own hormones off the internet, and being 2 meters tall, it is extremely difficult for me to give anyone the initial impression of, oh, that's a cis woman, since height is a significant part of how people form an initial gendered impression. So, what do? I think that as trans people, we often find ourselves being jealous of each other. I can only speak for the experience as a singular trans woman, and one that has had quite a few privileges that a lot of other trans women simply don't have. I did eventually get state-sponsored hormone treatments, and it's pretty cheap now. I managed to survive being broke by sustaining myself on student grants in university, and all in all, I've gotten pretty lucky several times in my life. But I also have a situation where I will most likely never be what I initially hoped to be when I began my transition. I've made videos before around this, and they've captured my view on it pretty well, but much of what I've talked before around this subject has been around how the subject of this video manifests itself outwardly. And again, the subject is jealousy. And while many people assume that trans women jealousy is exclusively directed at cis women, I don't think that's true. I think trans women are most often jealous of other trans women, even fictional ones. We see the successes of other trans women and obviously want those successes for ourselves as well. But because there are so many factors in play for us, this envy becomes intense. Not only do we envy success in general, but we envy success in transitioning, often specific parts of it such as looks, hair, gendered appearance, voice, gendered mannerisms, lack of dysphoria, relationships, etc., etc., etc. And having dysphoria can often be a driver of all of these factors, as well as make each individually worse. This jealousy is also deeply personal. It's hard to draw any universal conclusions from this because all transitions are unique and because of wildly different circumstances all over the world, so whatever you latch onto will presumably also be unique, such as, for me, Claire, at least for a while. When trans people begin transitioning, a lot of us have some sort of transitioning goal in mind. At least they did when I began my transition. These goals change over time, often become more realistic, and eventually settle around where we are anyway. In fact, sometimes I see people say that I am a transitioning goal, which is... So if going stealth is not in my future, which it definitely isn't, especially since I'm monetizing my transness for profit on the internet by being openly trans, what would I do? Well, even then I was openly trans. I didn't have the opportunity to disconnect from my real life to start fresh, so to say. So, if I was going to be openly trans, I would at least do so while looking good. In short, I would compensate. This is where I began my extremely modest and futile career as a model. I had managed to get a spot at an agency founded by a friend of a friend. The reason I was doing it wasn't for money. I rarely got paid anything at all, or even fame, although that was a small part of it, but I didn't really get any of that. But it was the allure of beauty and feeling important. It's really hard to convey the energy that goes into a shoot. Designers clothing you, makeup artists making sure that you look perfect, photographers, lighting, and everything to make sure that you are the center of attention and that you look and feel perfect. Granted, you aren't actually in focus. Usually it's the clothes or the bag or whatever, but you feel like you're in focus. You feel radiant. At the times, I got people contacting me, saying that they were envious of my looks, that me showing people that you could be trans and beautiful had motivated them to come out as trans as well. And I was very flattered. I had a similar experience when Andrea Peggi came out as trans. And again, I had the thought, damn, I wish I could have that. And on the shoot, I did. But the shoots are fleeting, and the view that we envy is seen as permanent, when it of course is not. But in my mind, I saw modeling as a way to secure confidence to the point where I could avoid envy, because it's a pretty nasty emotion to feel. Young people from all over the community are joining up to fight insecurity. I'm doing my part. 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 They're doing their part. Are you? Join the modeling industry. Service guarantees confidence. Would you like to know more? Why don't I even do that? The thing is though, modeling is also extremely competitive. Transness isn't a contest, but modeling definitely is. There is only a finite amount of spots on the runway, and if your friend gets the spot, that might mean you don't. And this mindset, combined with dysphoria driving envy, combines to a very bitter combination. It's possible I have this attitude because I rarely relate with other trans women. I began my transition in a healthcare system that radically changed only a few months after I had begun interacting with it. So the way my transition was handled by my doctors is more similar to an older generation of trans women, because those that interact with the system today don't have the same hoops to jump through, even though obviously there are still too many of them. The mindset that I had when I began my transition doesn't really exist anymore, and stealth is no longer the default goal of transitioning, and that's a good thing. But just as the overall discourse around trans issues has changed dramatically over the last decade, so have my own personal goals as well. And sometimes I feel like I don't have any goals at all. Obviously, my modeling career didn't really go anywhere, and because you can't look like a model 100% of the time, it doesn't really work in the long term. So you end up aimless. And what do you do with an aimless transition? I've noticed that one thing we rarely talk about in the trans community is bitterness. I suspect this is because, well, it's a bummer to talk about and no one wants to talk about things that make us sad. It's also one of those things that we don't mention because we don't want to scare away pre-transition trans people. We don't want to make it seem that being trans sucks. And it doesn't. Being trans rules. Although sometimes it doesn't. Transitioning is a process, but being able to finish that process is something that very few people can do. Again, whatever finishing means to you. A lot of trans people still see themselves as being early in their transition, or having basically finished it, having done all the work that needs to be done but not repeated. But what about trans people who are stuck in the middle? There are so many things I want to do with my own transition that still haven't happened. I began my transition over 8 years ago and I still haven't changed my legal name. For the longest time it was because I was broke. I couldn't afford it, so the paperwork was left sitting. Same with my wardrobe, something I still struggle with. My mind is wired in the sense of, I can't afford to do that, in regards to almost everything. Even when in reality, now I actually can, thanks to YouTube being a good job, and something that my history degree is actually good for. But because I was poor for the majority of my transition, I settled. A lot. I postponed most things until better days, until one day I didn't remember what the things I wanted to do even were. So instead I just live life as usual, stuck in the middle, which is what we all do, really. And that's fine, but that's not really where I wanted to be at the end of my transition. And obviously my transition isn't over, I'm not done yet, but still. And sometimes I find myself becoming bitter because of that. I see younger trans people go through a healthcare system that is far more improved over what I had to deal with, and as such can transition far easier and cheaper. And I can see older trans people transition with resources that didn't exist a decade ago. And sometimes I can see all of these people transitioning in a pace that to me seems quicker than I ever could. Even now, when I do YouTube, I'm subject to a similar mindset. But being on YouTube and seeing trans YouTubers is basically an onslaught of seeing trans people that have succeeded, because those are the narratives we want to hear. The story of trans people that don't fit into the mold of traditional transness either stand out so much that they aren't relatable, or they don't get picked up at all. So what you see is basically a slice of transness and not really a representative selection, even though anyone can go and have a YouTube channel. So obviously you become envious here too. I find myself becoming envious with other trans women on YouTube, partially because of their success as YouTubers, but mostly because of their transness. If they can do it, why can't I? The truth is, of course, that they can't either, or that I actually can. It's just that the view we have presented on YouTube isn't representative of the people you actually see, just like with the models you see in magazines, or trans women that only exist in fiction. This isn't new. When I talk to older trans people, they are also envious of me with the same resources that I had. But that still leaves a lot of us with a lot of unhealthy envy. I mentioned this in my essay about suffering, and how this sort of thinking can lead this envy to become bitterness, and that bitterness to exclusion. Dealing with that envy by denying that the envy is even valid in the first place. It doesn't help that transitioning is exciting for a lot of people who are just getting into it. It's new, it's fresh, and seeing those early changes from hormone therapy and doing voice training early on, that can be very fun. But that fun often comes from novelty, and when that passes, it just becomes work. And if you haven't gone where you need to go, you might have to start over again. And speaking from experience, there are a few things more demoralizing than trying to restart your transition 8 years into it. Like, I did the voice training thing, but my voice therapist said I didn't need it, although I said that I did. When I began my hormone treatments, my fertility was assumed to be none because of Swedish forced sterilization laws, so for the longest time I assumed that I was sterile, and when I eventually found out that I actually could do fertility treatments, I had to stop my HRT for a few months in order to basically have sex with a plastic cup. Now, usually that's the first step for many trans women starting hormone treatments, but it's a step that I had to restart again almost 8 years into it. And because of that, my body went through some hormone changes, my facial hair started coming back even worse than it was before, which isn't even supposed to happen. And then, all those times I blasted my face with the equivalent of a Death Star started to feel like they were for nothing. And I'm not alone in this situation. Obviously, transitioning is not a race, and every transition is unique, but there is a commonly understood pipeline. And if you fall out of that pipeline, then you're sort of left to figure stuff out entirely on your own, which is hard, if not impossible to do unless you have the resources to do so. And so for a lot of people transitioning, this means they have to do the same thing over and over again, seemingly forever, and going nowhere. This becomes almost insidious after a while because, as I mentioned in the beginning, people like hearing about trans stuff, and society is very interested in trans stuff, so if you do trans stuff, we become more and more defined by said trans stuff. So the longer you are submerged into the trans stuff sphere, the more it becomes who you are. And eventually a significant portion of your waking hours are consumed by the things you have to do or fail to do over and over again in order to functionally exist, like a Sisyphean torture over and over again. And it becomes pure bitterness. And then it can be hard to find the joy in being trans. I think a large part of transitioning is not being trans. It is doing the act of transitioning. And of course, this can mean all sorts of things. Some people get hormone replacement therapy, some people replace their wardrobe, some people get laser, whatever. But it's all still work. And yes, being alive in general is work. It's not glamorous, it's just doing. But transitioning is doing on top of the doing that everyone already does. And normally doing isn't so hard. But recently I've become so tired of doing. I think a lot of people feel like this. It's not a rejection of transitioning or anything, it's just the exhausted way we deal with being stuck in a rut. But reaching a point in our transitions when it starts to feel like drudging, relentless effort for minimal reward. And besides, how do we do anything when it feels like the sky is constantly falling on top of us? It's one thing to transition when the greatest words you have is, I wish I could look like that fictitious trans woman. It becomes harder to do anything when, on top of that, you worry about your next meal. If the world is going to fall apart into fascism, if the waters will boil, and if capitalism will lead to the final destruction of the human race. Doom scrolling seems to be the vibe for 2020. Every day it seems like something has become the worst it has ever been. And it can be pretty hard to do anything about your own transitioning in a setting like that. It can almost feel selfish, when in reality it's not, because it's impossible to care about every single thing all the time. Our minds simply aren't wired enough to do that. Add to that if you have depression or anxiety. It's no secret that I have both of those. Some days I get hit with anxiety so bad I can't read text or focus on any one thing for a few hours. Some days my depression hits me so hard it's physically hard to get out of bed at all. And if you're in a similar situation, you know that it's very hard to focus on things like transitioning with any sort of meaningful energy. Well, that's why I have a therapist. But it's impossible to sustain all of these things on your own, even with a good therapist. Which is why community is so important. Which is why it sucks even more that community is often the main driver of jealousy in the first place. But what I mean is, real community. I found that the people I became jealous of were rarely my peers. In modeling, the main source of my envy weren't my friends, who were in the same running as me. I was envious of high fashion models and super famous people. And early in my transition, I was jealous of basically celebrities. And in this age of social media, it's common for people to form communities around already established online communities, which is usually fine, especially in COVID. But remember, online representations of trans people aren't actually representative. So what we see as sort of the baseline default, even in smaller communities, isn't actually real. So while it sometimes sucks to hear, the best solution is just to log off, which coincidentally is also the cure for doom scrolling. It's not our fault it's like this though. Our minds like gathering in this way and feed off of negative feedback loops that we get from these spaces, and social media in general is tricking us into thinking that our harmful thinking patterns are actually normal. I found that unfollowing is very useful. To get rid of a lot of anxiety and envy around my own appearance, I've unfollowed basically every single modeling agency and fashion model from Instagram, which did wonders for my confidence. Because, I mean, come on, no one actually looks like that. I also think that a lot of fictional trans narratives need to deal with the fact that trans people are oftentimes still doing, or in the phase of finding their feet, or sometimes have to, well, start over later in life, because that's fine. But if you look at a lot of trans media, that's something we almost never see. I also think we should allow ourselves on occasion to accept that sometimes we can't do. Obviously, we should all do our best, but it's sometimes okay to let go of some things, too. It's okay to change your goals of transitioning. Maybe I'll never be like Claire. But that's fine. I'm still me. So, where do we go from here? Well, if you're online locked like I am, stop doing that. Obviously, the entire world is having a bit of a very intense moment right now. And if you're politically inclined like I am, it can feel like everything is happening all the time and far too much. Transitioning is already hard enough as it is, and we should be kinder to ourselves for maybe not being able to do it perfectly, especially considering the current circumstances. If you can, avoid doom scrolling. I know it's hard, it hits the brain so good, but it ruins the brain. Also, you should find the joy in transitioning, even if the things that seem very difficult to you might seem very easy for everyone else. Oftentimes because that perception isn't real. Dysphoria lies. Depression and anxiety lies. Social media lies. Public figures, well, we aren't really what we seem to be a lot of the time. And so be unapologetically kind to yourself and others. And of course, don't spend 10 hours a day looking at Twitter, Mia. One thing that I found helps is to step back, to completely disconnect yourself from whatever it is that is causing you distress. Be that transitioning anxiety or just anxiety in general. Do like I do and read questionable content every morning for a nice little hit of joy. Or learn a new skill. Hell, just make your own webcomic if you want to. Which brings me to the sponsor of this video, Skillshare. Skillshare offers a bunch of classes on all sorts of topics to distract you from the oncoming decline of human civilization and personal failings. I suggest the classes of iPad illustration and mastering illustration, which have nothing to do with the subject of this video, but that is exactly the point that I'm making in this video. An annual subscription is less than $10 a month, but the first 1,000 people who use the link in my description will get a free trial of Skillshare Premium membership for a limited time. Thank you for watching that video. If you liked the video, please consider liking and subscribing to my channel. If you want to see more of these videos and would like to support it financially, you can go to patreon.com/MiaMulder and help me do stuff in exchange for more streams and extra content and stuff like that. I'd like to thank Jeff for being so kind to answer my email, and I would like to thank all of my patrons who help me make these videos every month. I'd also like to give a special thanks to Aini Salminen, Alicia Crawford, Alki Historiker, Amalia, Amanda B, Athiet, Austin K, Autumn, Catherine Stenson, Charlotte Steffen, Christine Gutierrez, Cobra Sphere, Emil Rutkowski, Emilia Clark, Ezekiel Panibucci, Fox Kant, Huang Wu, Jade C, Jane Lesby, Janelle Torgesson, Gareth Arnold, Jim Sterling, Jörgen Danielsen, Joshua Analik, LPQ Silver, Linus 2.0, Morimer, Mountain Snow, MSG, Natalie Kapoor, Nia Pasaka, Nork 426, Pat, Phobos 2390, Rosie, Riley Knox, Safi Huck, Sitzrees, The Bread Santa, Thoros of Mir, Tiffany A, William Fuhustle, Ultimate Sanctibus, Vinder, Vivian Crow, Wolfgang the Grand High Exalted Wizard, and Zoya Kent. Thank you.